Hi everyone, welcome and thanks so much for having me at this event. My name is Damian Brady and I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, which is a pretty cool job. It means that I get to play with all of our cool software and cool tools for developers, learn how to use them and then share them with other people. It also means that I get a bit of a contact into the product teams as well and get to guide the direction of how they make their products and make them work for you. One of the really good things, though, is that I started at Microsoft because I was already kind of advocating for one of the products that we have, which is called Azure Pipelines. Now, you may be familiar with it. It's kind of a CI/CD tool. It's really useful for basically delivering everything that you want, your code, all the way out to production to your users. So let's have a look at what Azure Pipelines actually is. So it's billed as a tool to build, test, and deploy your application to any platform and any cloud. Now, it's a little bit more than that, and I want to kind of dive into what the more part is and how you can use it with third-party tools and things like that. So Azure Pipelines itself is part of a suite of tools called Azure DevOps. Now, Azure DevOps is supposed to contain everything that you need from an idea all the way through to running in production, right? It's got boards for managing your work, Azure repositories or Azure repos for holding your code, Azure pipelines for all your CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, Azure artifacts and Azure test plans as well to help manage your resources and all of your tests. And it's served as a service, so Azure DevOps Services, but also as Azure DevOps Server, so you can run it on premises if you want as well. Now, it's been around for quite a while under various names. And Azure Pipelines is kind of the bit that everybody talks about, or me certainly as a kind of DevOps advocate. Now, Azure Pipelines is built to be extremely flexible and work really, really well with pretty much anything, right? So it's designed to be able to deliver anything to any cloud or any platform, but as well as that on premises, or I've even deployed Python scripts to a Raspberry Pi before. So it's very flexible, has first-party support for containers and Docker and Kubernetes, complex workflows. It's extremely extensible. It's also free for open source and relatively free for closed source as well. But you don't want to hear me talk about all the marketing points of what Azure DevOps is. Let's have a look at what it can actually do and jump in and see what the tool actually looks like. All right, so I'm going to jump over to a demo here. We've got our Azure Pipelines right here. We can say create a new pipeline, which I'll do. And you can see right from the start, it asks you where your code lives. And so we can get our code from anywhere. Mine is in GitHub, which is also a Microsoft company now. It'll ask me to sign in and do all of that kind of stuff, and then ask me to find my code. So mine is living in GitHub, and it's this on-prem to the cloud, but I'm going to use a repository that is part of an organization. So the product called Tailwind Traders, and it was used for another one. So Tailwind Traders is a hardware supply company. They sell things like hammers and light bulbs and things like that. Really not important for this demo. So Azure Pipelines has looked at my code, and it's decided that it's had some guesses about what my code actually contains. So it can see there's some Docker stuff in there. So it's actually going to suggest templates to build Docker images, maybe push to Azure Kubernetes service. It's seen some ASP.NET in there as well, and so it's suggested that. Now, that's the one that I'm going to start with. And it will give me a template right from the start. So this is really a starting point. It's something to build on, and it's a good spot to land. So you can see we're triggering a new pipeline run on every time we commit to our main branch. We're running this on a Windows machine, but we can also run our builds on Ubuntu or on Mac as well. So you don't even need a Mac to do your iOS applications. We have some variables and some steps. We're doing some NuGet stuff, Visual Studio builds, and then a VS test. And this is all great. This is all pretty standard stuff. You can even, so when we move to this YAML definition, which has some advantages, which I'll talk about in a second, but when we move to this away from a UI, which we had before, where you could choose different steps and different tasks and change the settings and things, people were a little bit disappointed. They liked using the UI. So we've kind of brought it back. If you click on settings on any of these tasks, you can see You get a nice UI to change all of the settings from those. You can even search for tasks that are hosted or in the marketplace. So I might want to, do some load balancing. And I can use a task for Azure Network Load Balancer, choose that, and then choose all the stuff in my dropdowns and so on, and then add that task. So there's a lot to this. We don't have time to go through everything, and that's unfortunate because there's so much stuff in here. Where we've got an example here of just running our tests and so on. But I want to show you an example of something that's actually done. So let's look at one that I've done before. Now, this is the on-premises to the cloud, and I've kind of extended this a little bit. We've actually got multiple stages. So we're doing our build, then we're deploying to a test server, and then we're deploying to a production server as well. So something a little bit more realistic. Our build stage runs all of our tests, and then it produces a thing that we're going to deploy. So this artifact we're going to deploy. Once we've done that, we can deploy to our test and deploy to an actual on-premises server, which is what we're doing at the moment. And then before we go to production, we have to pass a check, which in this case is just me approving it. Now, these checks can be really powerful. If we just jump in and have a look at our environments, so this is our production environment here. We've got production, and we can see that this server here is one of the resources that we have in production. We can also add a Kubernetes service and things like that. But the really cool thing is this approvals and checks. So right now, I've just got an approval. So either myself or my boss needs to approve any deployment to production. But there's all these other checks that we can add as well. We can even hit a REST API or invoke an Azure function, which means that we can reach out to anything else and check that we're safe to go to our production environment, which is really cool for third-party services, for feature flags and things like that. It means that you can deploy to a canary environment, for example, and then depending on how that's performing in production, automatically this check will monitor that, and if everything is okay, it can roll that out to production as well. So whether you're using Split or any other tool like that, you can actually integrate this stuff and kind of go beyond that standard deploy to production stuff, which is really handy. All right, so there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to go into it too much. One other thing I just wanted to point out as well is this. Some of the UI in here is really good. So we can see our testing. We can see how that's gone over the course of our project as well. So it's actually starting to take longer to run our tests now. It only ran in 20 seconds. We've passed most of them as well. We can have a look and actually drill down into these tests and see some information about what the test actually did, stack traces if they're possible as well. So a ton of stuff we can do in here. But this is still kind of standard, what you would expect out of a CI/CD tool. I just want to highlight a couple of things that we saw there, though. So number one, we can get our code from anywhere. My code was in GitHub, but you can get it from any Git repository, Bitbucket, on-premises stuff, Team Foundation version control if you're still using that. So you can get your code from anywhere. When you start, you get access to all of these templates that give you a really good starting point. Now I choose a basic one, but you could do one that actually builds a Docker container and deploys it out to an Azure Kubernetes service or something as well. So a lot of power there. All of this is defined in YAML, and the big advantage of doing that is this file exists alongside your code. So when somebody checks out your repo or somebody clones your repository, they're not just getting the code that represents your product, they're also getting the way that you deploy that code. It also means if you need to branch and add some features to your product, and that's going to change the way that your product builds and deploys, you can do that all in one branch. You're not reliant on a tool to kind of keep in sync with where the code lives. So defining these things in YAML or something similar is really, really handy. We also didn't really look at that syntax too much, but there's also this hierarchy of different stages that have multiple jobs, that have multiple steps. We can look at our environments that we're deploying to as well. So these complex workflows are really supported very well as well. All right, so that's the basic stuff. Let's look a little bit about what we can do if we extend and look at the integration points for Azure Pipelines. Now, this is where you can start using tools like Split and other ones to kind of manage those workflows. So let's jump back to our demo, and I'm going to look at some code now. So this is a YAML definition, and it's not really a real build because you don't want to sit there and watch these real builds run. Nobody wants to sit there and watch, this stuff. So we've got this build. This is the same syntax. So we've got a trigger here. So any commit to our main branch. We have a build stage, which starts off with a notification light. Now this one's running on Ubuntu. So it's a Linux build. We're telling it not to check out our code because in this particular stage, or this particular job, we don't need our code. All we're doing is making an HTTP call to the light that's sitting behind me. So I'm going to kick this off just so you can see this running at the same time. Basically, I'm going to turn this light on to say, we're building at the moment. We're going to build our application. We're going to do a bunch of stuff here. And then we're going to deploy it to our test server. Now here, it gets a little bit more complicated. And I'll walk through that in a second, but I want to kick this off. One other integration point as well. I could just commit a change, and yes, because the trigger is on our main branch, it will fire off this workflow. But I'm actually going to trigger it using just an HTTP request. So I'm going to use Postman, but you could easily use curl or whatever tool that can call out to Azure Pipelines. But I'm also I'm going to use that to hit the REST API. So Azure DevOps, all parts of it are accessible via an HTTP API. So really, you can just hit this REST API and get it to do things for you. So I'm going to do that. Let's just kick this off. Really, I'm just saying, doing a post to a particular URL to say, I want to kick this off and do my run. So we're sending that request. It's hopefully going to work soon. It's given us some JSON response, so that means it's worked. Let's just have a look at this in the UI. I'm just going to refresh, and we should be able to see that it's triggered a new build. So I just did that with an HTTP endpoint. So any product that can call out to something else could trigger your build or your workflow. Now, while this is running, we should be able to see these two stages. Our build stage, the first one, that notification light, and you'll see in my video, if you're looking, that notification light just went on. It's gone orange, it's kind of pulsing. Not sure how well that comes across on the video, but it's going to keep doing that while it does that work. We can look at the logs while this is running too. So while it's running, it's dumping all of these logs out, and you can see, what stuff it's doing. It's grabbing all the code, it's going to do its build, or it's pretending to do its build, but this is just a demo, right? Building our application, doing a bunch of stuff, uploading our artifacts, and then we're going to deploy to test, and we're going to change the light to represent whether it succeeded or failed. All right, let's jump back to the code because I want to talk about this deployment stuff here. So our deployment depends on our build. So we need to have created our artifact before we can actually deploy our artifact, which makes sense. We're also saying that this job is a deployment job. So it's specifically to deploy an application. And that gives us a few extra kind of little features in Azure Pipelines to manage a deployment. Number one is that we can define an environment that we're deploying to. And you saw before, that means we can secure those environments. We can put gates on those environments to make sure that you can't go to that particular environment unless you've passed these tests, or you can't do it inside business hours, or it needs approvals from somebody. A whole lot of stuff is possible there. So we're running this on Ubuntu, and now we get this really cool stuff about the deployment strategies. And this is where we're going kind of beyond what the CI/CD does. In general. So at the moment, we're just doing a run once strategy. So what we could also do is, if I just pull that out, we could also do a canary strategy. And you can see that build succeeded now. So the light's gone green. It'll stay green for a little while and then stop. So we can do a canary deployment. And this can be really, really handy for things like feature flags. So we'll do a deployment to a particular server and do it as a canary deployment, and then monitor what's happening, and then deploy that out to the rest of the servers, provided everything's okay. And we could just do that with a straight feature flag swap rather than a new deployment or something like that. The great thing about Canary is that it gives you the opportunity to test in production, which I love. We can also do rolling strategies. So we can, if we have 10 different servers in our production environment, we can roll it out to them gradually. And we get a lot of control over how we can do that. So let's just paste that one back in. We can also see that we're just doing a run once because we're just doing a basic example. And our deployment phase has these steps. So at the moment, we are downloading the artifacts that we produced in our build, which we actually don't have to do. We can get that automatically just as a result of a deployment, I believe. But we're pulling down those artifacts to make sure we're deploying our application the easiest way possible by just waiting for 6 seconds. And we can do a bunch of other stuff. What we can do as well, though, is have these pre-deploy phases. So before we do our deployment to production, we can do things like change the way the traffic works, or redirect 10% of our traffic to a particular server where we're going to put our new application with the feature flag turned on. We can do all of that sort of stuff. There's also post-route traffic. So after we do our deployment, we can say, okay, we're going to move all the traffic to our new production servers. So a lot of control we get as a result of doing these deployment phases as well. And that's pretty much it. So we've got a couple of extra tasks right at the end just to control our light. And these are based on conditions. So if everything succeeded beforehand, we'll get this success light, which is green. And if it failed, we get this fail light, which will be red. So we can kind of integrate both with these tools. Like in my case, I'm just using a LifeX bulb. So that API, we can integrate in our pipeline to do that work. And we also saw that we could hit a REST API to actually trigger that workflow too. So we can get this integration on both sides. Now, what about the other stuff? What about day-to-day stuff? So right now, I'm just using a few out-of-the-box tasks. We saw some of them in the marketplace there. There's a lot more in the marketplace that you can do as well. So let's just jump over. If you go to marketplace.visualstudio.com, these are all of the extensions for Azure DevOps. So it's not just Azure Pipelines. You can do things like have notes or code quality using Endepend. There's a whole bunch of these. You can sync Azure Boards and Slack, for example. So all of these extensions are available. If we just look at the Azure Pipelines ones, we can see a few more of those. You can see right now there's 1,183 different extensions for Azure Pipelines. And they can do everything from deploy to on-prem servers to managing load balancers to pretty much anything you can think of. But if that task that you want, if the thing you want it to do is not in the marketplace, you have a couple of options. Number one, you can just write Bash or PowerShell or whatever script you want and do that work yourself. Or you can build your own marketplace extension. So if you click on build your own here, it'll walk you through developing this web extension. So I've built a few of these. They're really not that difficult. It's basically a case of creating a manifest to say this is what's in this artifact, and then hooking into certain areas that are available to you. And all of the documentation will walk you through doing that. So if you wanted to build your own extension to work with your own products or do your own thing, that's entirely possible as well. So there's a lot of different spots where you can integrate and you can do that kind of work. So a few points just from that little demo there. There are REST APIs into Azure DevOps to do pretty much anything you want. If you can basically control it from any application is the secret there. So Azure DevOps is extremely extensible from that respect, but it's also extensible when you're doing that work. So there are tasks, a ton of tasks in the marketplace that you can use, or you can run your own scripts in Bash or PowerShell or anything like that. The agents that we host ourselves have a whole bunch of software on them already. So as an example, you can run a Bash script on Windows because we have WSL installed on the Windows agents. So you can just write Bash and it doesn't matter what agent you run it on as well. Now, if you really want to, you can also write your own extension. And that doesn't have to be published publicly. You can just have that locally in your organization. And so your team can use those extensions as well. So a lot of extensibility points to kind of take you beyond that CI/CD that we see so frequently. So just finally, if you want to get to learn a little bit more of this, I would highly recommend the Microsoft Learn course, building applications on Azure DevOps. That will walk you through a kind of a real world scenario, complete with demos and trying things out of how Azure DevOps works and how Azure Pipelines works. And of course, our documentation, we spend a lot of time on our Azure Docs at the moment. So have a look at those two URLs if you want to get started with Azure DevOps and Azure Pipelines. And with that, hopefully you learned a few things, and I'll be around for Q&A in the Slack, and thanks.